Zakarias in the Wind. The Scar and the Silence, Montana Territory. Autumn of 1879. The land lay open and bare, caught between the dying breath of summer and the long hush of coming snow. The morning wind sliced across the plains with a sharpness that seemed personal, like it meant to remind every creature breathing that survival here was not a given. Zakarias Steel rode into that wind without blinking. His coat flared behind him, dust collecting on the hem like memory. The horse beneath him, a steady gelding the color of rust and ash, moved with the sure-footed gait of something that had traveled hard miles. Beneath the brim of Zakarias's wide weather-stained hat, most of his face stayed hidden, but what little was visible didn't need much sunlight to leave an impression. A scar cut down from just below his left eye, dragging across his jaw like something done with purpose, deep, uneven, and still pink at the edges, despite the seasons that had passed. People either stared too long or didn't dare look at all. He preferred the second. He wasn't interested in pity or the polite lies of townsfolk who looked away while tightening their children's grip in passing. Zakarias had lived on the fringe of the world for as long as he could remember. Not out of bitterness, but out of something deeper and harder experience. He worked when work came, drove cattle, broke stubborn horses, mended fences, twisted by storms or torn by strays. Whatever bought him time and distance from questions, from assumptions, from warmth he hadn't earned. He never stayed long, not in towns, not in company, just long enough to sleep with his back to a wall and earn enough coins to ride out again. That morning the wind didn't bother him. It was the kind of wind that kept men honest and women weary, and it matched the rhythm of something settled in his chest, a quiet he didn't question anymore. He wasn't looking for anything, not help, not purpose, and certainly not anyone else's burdens. But the prairie had its own ideas. A broken wagon, a woman with unflinching eyes. It was the frost he noticed first, thin silver lace clinging to the bramble and pine that grew along the edges of the dried creek bed east of where his cabin sat 3 hours' ride north. It meant the cold had come earlier than expected, and with it the quiet warnings of winter. Zakarias slowed his horse out of instinct more than intent, scanning the scrub ahead for movement for threat or game. What he saw instead was a broken wagon tilted at a cruel angle, one wheel shattered and bent beneath the weight of what had once been family's hope. A mule was gone. Run off or stolen, he couldn't tell. What remained was the wreckage and the 3 souls still anchored to it. A child sat on a flat rock, cradling a torn cloth doll as if it might breathe. Another child, younger, peeked from behind the skirts of a woman who stood in front of them both like a wall. Her rifle rested against one shoulder, hand poised near the trigger, and her eyes, dark, unreadable, tracked his every movement as he drew closer. Zakarias reined in his horse, but didn't speak right away. He watched her, taking in the tight braid that framed her face, the way her body shifted slightly to shield her children. Her clothes were worn, but they'd been scrubbed clean with care. She was a woman who knew hard living and didn't dress it up with desperation. Her mouth was set in a line that didn't tremble even as the wind pressed against her spine. "You hurt?" he asked at last, his voice rough from cold and silence. She didn't flinch. "No," she answered, steady and sure. "But we are stranded." He nodded once dismounted with the grace of someone used to saddle and snow. Her hand didn't leave the rifle. Not until the smaller child tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Mama, I'm cold." Only then did she shift slightly, laying the weapon down beside her. "I'm Theodora Granger," she said. "This is Elaine and this little one's EMTT." He didn't smile, didn't offer soft words. "Zakarias Steel," he said. "I ride out of Fort Benton." Was passing through. And in that moment something unspoken moved between them, not kindness, not yet but a recognition. A mirror held up in frost. A stranger's mercy. The offer of shelter. Theodora spoke with a tone carved from bone-deep survival. "We were headed south," she explained, her voice low, but even, to Helena. "My husband passed 2 winters ago. I was trying to get to my cousin's land." Zakarias didn't ask more. He turned and crouched beside the wagon, assessing the damage without comment. The axle was cracked clean through. Useless out here. No fixing it without a proper post, tools, and time, none of which this woman had. "You won't make it like this," he said. She didn't argue. That alone told him more about her than words could. "We've been camped since the wheel gave out." 2 nights now, she added. "Food for a day." "Maybe." Zakarias stood slowly, glancing out across the open land. Nothing but sky and dirt and the long shadow of winter approaching. He could ride on. No one would blame him. This wasn't his fight, not his burden to carry. But he didn't. "You're not far from my cabin," he said, shifting the reins in his hand. 3 hours' ride. I'll take you there." Theodora narrowed her eyes. "Why?" He shrugged once. "Rough and simple. Because I'd want someone to do the same if it were me and my kin stuck out here." She looked at him, then not at the scar, but straight into his eyes. Something in her softened, a breath that didn't feel like surrender, but permission. "All right," she said. And just like that, 2 people who had never planned to need one another began to rewrite the road ahead. The ride toward shelter, miles of silence, and first trust. It took time to gather what little they had. A single trunk worn at the corners but carefully packed. 2 canvas sacks, one with dried beans, the other with threadbare clothes and a tin comb. Zakarias tied them to his pack horse without a word. He moved with the economy of someone who had done this before, loading what mattered, leaving what didn't. Theodora lifted Elaine onto his gelding with a strength born of necessity, not ease. Zakarias caught EMTT mid-wiggle and swung the child gently into the saddle in front of his sister. The little boy's fingers clutched at Zakarias's coat like they knew safety instinctively before language had time to catch up. "You can ride with them," Zakarias said, nodding toward the saddle. "I'll walk." She hesitated. "You won't make 3 hours on foot before dark." "I've walked further." Still, she climbed up behind her children, settling them between her arms. Zakarias led the horse by the reins, stepping into the rising wind like it was part of him. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Theodora watched him from above, the way his boots found purchase on uneven ground, how he checked the gelding's gait every few yards, making sure the little ones weren't jolted. The afternoon deepened, sky turning gold at the edges. EMTT dozed against her coat. Elaine's head bobbed before resting on her chest. By the time the cabin came into view, small with a slanted roof and stone chimney, the sky was bleeding orange and purple, and Theodora felt the first real warmth of the day flicker inside her. Not from the fire, yet unlit, but from the man who had not once looked back to see if she deserved this help. He simply gave it. Firelight and the first night of safety. The door groaned open, hinges stiff from early frost. Zakarias stepped in, first striking a match and lighting the lantern by the window. The glow pooled low and golden across the wood floor. The cabin was simple. A bed with thick quilts, a stone hearth still cold, a corner table stacked with tools and gear. But it was clean, dry, safe. Zakarias built the fire, quickly practiced stacking pine logs and kindling with the rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Theodora knelt beside him without being asked, unwrapping bread crusts and dried meat for the children. EMTT curled on the bed before finishing his meal, already asleep. Elaine followed minutes later, her doll tucked beneath her chin. "You take the bed," Zakarias said, standing. "They'll rest easier with you beside them." She looked up. "And you, I've slept colder floors." It wasn't bravado, just fact. That night, Zakarias sat by the fire, blade in hand, slowly running a whetstone across its edge. Theodora stood by the hearth, arms wrapped around herself. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked. He looked up the firelight, catching the edge of his scar. "Why do you travel alone with 2 children and no wagon?" She exhaled, not in frustration, but in shared weariness. "Because I had no choice." He nodded. "Same." And in that silence, something opened. Not wide, not loud, but enough. Scars, kindness, and a whispered kiss. Later that night, when the fire had died down to red coals and the wind had quieted to a whisper, Theodora remained standing at the edge of the hearth. Zakarias sat cross-legged near the door, his blade now sheathed, but his shoulders still watchful. She spoke into the hush. "Did it hurt?" He knew what she meant. He didn't touch the scar. "Yes." "Was it war number bandits?" "I was riding guard south of Miles City. They left me for dead." She stepped closer to the fire, closer to him. "And you survived?" He looked at her, eyes still and deep. "I don't know if that's the word I'd use." They stood that way for a long moment. Then she moved to him, not fast, not timid, just sure. Her fingers touched the edge of his jaw, tracing the scar, slowly, gently. He didn't flinch. She said, barely louder than breath, "You saved us. You're not broken, Zakarias. You're mine." Then she kissed him. It wasn't long, wasn't urgent, but it was true. And for the first time in years, Zakarias Steel allowed himself to be wanted. Morning frost and the rhythm of belonging. Dawn crept soft and silver over the plains, turning the frost to glass. Theodora woke before the children pulled her shawl tight and stepped outside. Her breath plumed in the chill as she crossed the woodpile. The silence of the land pressed into her chest, not heavy but reverent. She had once feared quiet. Now she found peace in it. Out back, Zakarias was already splitting wood, his sleeves rolled back, steaming in the cold. The rhythm of his axe against the stump was steady as a heartbeat. She approached, boots crunching frost. "I thought I'd beat you out here," she said. He paused. "You almost did." She tilted her head. "You don't sleep much, do you? Not when the air's this clear. Feels like you ought to do something with it." She watched him work, how each swing landed clean and true. "You always need to be useful." He glanced at her, not a smile, but the closest thing. "I was raised on the belief that if you're breathing, you best be earning it." She knelt to help him stack the kindling. "Who taught you that?" "My father. Said God gave us hands for work and a back to carry what the world don't want." She nodded slowly, wind tugging her braid. "Did he live long enough to see the man you became?" "No. He drowned in a flood when I was 16. Ma followed 2 winters later. He leaned on the stump. After that, I figured it were better to be alone than to lose again." She looked up at him, quiet, sure. But you took us in. That was different. How you weren't asking to stay. A question hanging in the cold. Theodora brushed snow from her skirt and stood. And if I wanted to, Zakarias met her gaze. He didn't speak right away, but the pause wasn't hesitation, it was reverence. Inside the cabin, EMTT's sleepy voice called for her. She turned toward the door. "I'll bring in the rest," he said low. She nodded and walked back to the cabin. That evening, as lanterns flickered and snow tapped gently against the windows, Theodora mended a stocking beside the fire. EMTT played with a carved horse. Elaine arranged beans into lopsided circles. Zakarias sat at the table, whittling pine. "You ever miss town?" she asked. He didn't look up. "I pass through. Buy what I need, but I don't stay long." "Because of your scar," he shook his head. "Because I like the quiet." She set her stitchum down. "My husband talked too much. Couldn't stand a minute of silence." Zakarias finally looked at her. "Was he good to you?" He tried, but he didn't understand stillness. He called it loneliness. Zakarias stood crossed to the fire, crouched beside her. "Stillness ain't loneliness," he said. "Not if someone's willing to share it with you." She reached out, touched the back of his hand. "I'm not afraid of quiet." He turned his palm to hers. Slow. Steady. "Then maybe you found the right place to stay. A mother's hope. A cowboy's gift." Later that night, after EMTT had fallen asleep against her shoulder, Theodora carried him to the bed. She returned, eyes bright with something unspoken. "May I ask something of you?" she said. Zakarias sat straighter. "You can ask anything. I want to teach Elaine her letters, and EMTT when he's ready." He nodded. "There's chalk and slate in the chest. I want them to have more than I did. Not just survival. I want them to know there's more to life than hardship." Zakarias stepped forward. "Then I'll build them a table by the window," he said, "so they can see the light while they learn." She reached up, palm pressed to his chest. "You give without asking. You have me, Zakarias, and I'm not going anywhere." His arms came around her like they'd always known how, the sound of a home. Being made snow piled thick against the cabin. The fire crackled. Elaine copied letters on a slate. Theodora's fingers guided hers with patience learned in hardship. Zakarias leaned in the doorway, wiping mud from his boots. He'd just returned from checking traps. "You learned to teach like that from your mother?" he asked. "No. Mama didn't read. My father did when he was sober." Zakarias stepped inside. "First man I met who could read was a preacher on a cattle drive. Bible thicker than his saddle." Theodora smiled faintly. Funny how the right person can open doors you didn't know were shut. Elaine kept tracing letters. EMTT played by the hearth. Later, Theodora sat beside Zakarias with a cloth in hand, tending his cracked knuckles. "I used to think there was something wrong with me," she whispered. "They expected I'd marry again, but I never wanted to." He looked at her reverently. "I've spent so long thinking I wasn't fit to be looked at kindly." "You are," she said. "You're mine." That night he followed her to bed and stayed. When the land begins to soften. By late January, the snow had packed high against the cabin walls, curling over the roof in wind-blown drifts. The pine trees stood hushed under their weight branches, bowed as though in prayer. But inside, warmth lived in steady rhythm. Theodora stood over the table Zakarias had built, fingers guiding Elaine's hand as she traced letters in careful rows on the slate, each stroke a seed of something bigger. Zakarias leaned in the doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth stained with resin and ash. He'd been out at first light checking the traps along the north ridge. His coat was dusted with ice and his cheeks flushed from wind, but he didn't speak. Just watched. Watched Theodora's calm. Watched the gentleness in her teaching. Watched a woman who had come into his home and quietly filled the air with something he had not known he missed. "You learned to teach like that from your mother?" he asked after a while. Theodora glanced up surprised by the question. "No. Mama didn't read. She thought books were for people who lived softer lives. It was my father who taught me letters when he wasn't drinking." Zakarias nodded and came closer. "I didn't know anyone who could read when I was a boy. Not until I joined a drive and met a preacher, carried a Bible thicker than his saddle." Theodora smiled faintly. Funny how the right person can open a door you didn't know was shut. Elaine's pencil scratched again across the slate. EMTT nearby dragged a cloth horse in slow circles by the hearth, humming to himself. A fire popped. Outside, the snow whispered against the windows. Inside, something firmer than survival was taking root. Quiet confessions. Beneath the firelight. That night, after the children were tucked beneath their quilts and the fire had burned to a warm hum of coals, Zakarias sat by the hearth, working pine salve into the raw cracks on his knuckles. Cold air had split them open again, and though he barely winced, the skin looked angry and raw. Theodora returned from the corner with a warm cloth and sat beside him on the floor without asking. "You don't have to do that," he murmured. "I know," she said, pressing the cloth gently to the worst of it. They didn't speak for a while. The silence between them had shifted in recent weeks. It no longer held the weight of things unsaid. It carried what had already been spoken without words. She pressed the cloth into his palm and let her fingers stay there. "I used to think there was something wrong with me," she said, eyes watching the flames. "After Thomas passed, people expected I'd mourn for a year, maybe 2, then remarry. Quietly. Quickly. Like love was something to refill like a bucket." Zakarias looked at her. "Not surprised, just listening. I didn't," she continued. "Didn't want to. Until I met you." His voice was low when he answered. "I've spent so long thinking I wasn't fit to be looked at kindly." She turned to him, then eyes soft. "You've never been just the man with a scar to me. You've always been more. You've been mine." She leaned her head to his shoulder, and he let out a breath like he'd been holding it for years. That night when they went to bed, he followed her. No words, just belonging. Rhythm of a family, becoming real. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of their days took on the shape of something permanent. Not the urgency of survival, but the slow unfolding of a life worth living. Theodora taught Elaine to count, using dried beans, making rows and circles across the table Zakarias had built. EMTT turned scrap wood into crooked sleds and dragged them across the frozen yard, proud of every wobbly line. Zakarias oiled the rifle Theodora had carried that first day, cleaning it with a reverence that didn't speak of fear but of respect, and hung it above the hearth, where it would stay dry and near. There was laughter now. Real, free laughter that came from the belly, not the throat. Elaine's giggles when EMTT fell into a snowbank. Theodora's voice rising in a mock scold when she found mud tracked through the cabin. Zakarias didn't laugh often, but when he did, it was low and full, like thunder far off in a safe direction. Each day they added to something. A place, a home. a kind of peace. No one said it aloud, but even the quiet had begun to sound like belonging. The promise of staying. More than a season. One morning, Theodora stood barefoot in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl, watching the sun rise behind the trees. The air was still cold, but soft, less sharp than it had been. Spring was near. Zakarias came up behind her, resting a hand lightly at the small of her back. "You thinking of leaving?" he asked. She turned light in her eyes. "No. I was thinking this is the first place I've breathed easy since I was a girl." He looked out toward the horizon, toward the long stretch of pine and melting snow. "It's rough living here. Come spring, the floods rise. The mud takes your boots, and the mosquitoes take your patience." She smiled gently. "I've lived through worse." He nodded. "I know you have." She turned to face him fully. "There's room here, isn't there, to build there is. Then I'd like to stay, not just through spring, for good." He stepped past her onto the porch, boots creaking on the old boards. The wind had shifted. Not spring yet, but close. "We'll need to dig a new well when the thaw comes," he said, "and I'll put up a second room off the back." She folded her arms. "Do you want that?" He looked at her long and clear. "I want a life with you. Not just a season." She stepped forward and pressed her hands against his chest. "Then you've already won." His arms came around her, not fierce but sure. The preacher and the leather ring. The days warmed. The snow thinned. One afternoon, while Theodora gathered dried herbs into glass jars for the kitchen wall Zakarias had carved, Elaine and EMTT played near the creek. Their laughter carried back through the trees. Zakarias stood in the threshold, watching it all. Womanland children, and something in his chest settled. "You've made something good here," Theodora said, coming to stand beside him. "We both did." She tilted her head. "You ever think about what comes next?" "I do," he answered. "But not the way I used to. I used to think it would all be taken away. Now I think about how to keep it strong." She stepped barefoot onto the porch, toes curling against the damp wood. "There's a traveling preacher due through in May," she said. "He stops at the river settlement every spring." Zakarias leaned against the post. "You thinking about going? I'm thinking about marrying you." He turned the air between them still. "You sure I've never been more?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a loop of worn leather braided into a rose. "I started this the day you said you were staying for good. Didn't know what I'd say when the time came." She took it, fingers tracing the worn edges. "This is better than gold. Then wear it when we go." They married beneath a cottonwood bent by wind, and when they walked home hand in hand, neither of them looked back. The summer that gave more than it took. That summer the land gave them more than they needed. The sun rose early and lingered late, casting gold across the patch of soil where Theodora's fingers had planted careful rows. Beans climbed the twine she tied with quiet precision. Squash leaves unfurled like open palms, and their vines filled the baskets faster than she could preserve. Zakarias built a fence around the garden to keep the deer from slipping through the trees at night. Each morning he walked its perimeter with a rifle in hand and a quiet focus in his eyes. The work was heavy but purposeful, every hammer strike a wordless vow. Inside the cabin he carved a second cradle, smaller than EMTT's had been, its edges smooth and low-shaped from pine that had been drying behind the cabin since late winter. He didn't say why he was building it. He didn't need to. Theodora moved slower now. Her hands lingered on her belly when she thought no one saw. She never spoke the word aloud, not even to him. But he knew. He waited. Until one night, with the rain tapping soft against the roof and the children asleep, she reached for his hand beneath the quilt and guided it to the slight curve just beginning beneath her gown. "Spring will bring more than green shoots," she whispered. He didn't speak. He only kissed her long and slow, and rested his hand over hers, the promise silent but sure, the birth of Celis, a room of their own. By the time the leaves turned, the hills lit up in amber and fire. In the second room, Zakarias had built with his own hands. Theodora gave birth to their son. The labor was long, and the wind outside clawed at the shutters, but the walls held. The roof did not leak. And in the end, with sweat dampening her brow and Zakarias's hand in hers, she brought forth a child with lungs full of life and fists curled like roots. She named him Celis, after her grandfather. The name felt like strength and legacy, like something meant to last. Zakarias held the boy in the crook of his arm, marveling at the weight of something so small and yet so anchoring. He didn't cry, not then, but he whispered a vow against the child's downy head, a promise he would never break. The family grew into their new rhythm. Elaine helped clean bottles. EMTT showed Celis a carved horse with the gravity of an older brother. Theodora nursed and taught and hummed lullabies he hadn't heard before, soft and slow and steady as the land outside. Zakarias no longer rode with the cattle drives. He had no reason to leave. Everything he had once chased now lay within arm's reach. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it meant to be full. A home, shaped by steady hands. Years passed, not in a blur, but in the slow grounding rhythm of seasons well lived. Elaine learned to read so well she began writing letters to a cousin she had never met. EMTT built a raft from scrap wood and floated it once down the shallow creek, just long enough to return soaked but triumphant. Celis took his first steps on the porch Zakarias had sanded smooth by hand. He learned to plant, with Theodora's guidance, placing seeds in such neat straight rows they looked like ribbons stitched into the soil. Theodora tended to them all with a grace born of fire and hardship. Her hands bore calluses, but her touch was always gentle. Zakarias, once a man of silence and distance, became a man who held his children close and spoke their names like prayers. The rifle still hung above the hearth, but it gathered more dust now. The danger wasn't gone, just farther out, less urgent. There was safety here, and with safety there was room to breathe. Each night after the fire had dimmed and the children's breathing softened, Theodora rested her head against Zakarias's chest. He held her like she was the first good thing he'd ever known. And maybe she was. He never forgot the cold silence of his earlier years. But he didn't live in them anymore. He lived here, where love was not loud but sure. The echo of footsteps, the weight of calm. One afternoon, as Zakarias returned from checking the fence line, he carried a splintered post over his shoulder. His face was lined with concern. Tracks, he said, setting the wood down by the porch. Boot prints, small, fresh, near the ridge. Theodora looked up from where she knelt with the planting satchel. You think they meant trouble could have been a trapper, or someone passing through, but the prints were warm when I found them. She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her skirt. We'll keep the lamp burning. He nodded. And I'll keep the rifle loaded. They didn't speak more of it. Didn't need to. She trusted the land, but she trusted him more. That night, after the children had fallen quiet, she found Zakarias sitting on the porch. Rifle laid across his lap, one boot braced against the rail. The stars were bright, the moon thin like a silver coin. "You expecting someone?" she asked. "No. But I've learned not to be surprised." She sat beside him, tucking her legs beneath her skirt. The night pressed close, but not cold. "You afraid?" He looked at her steady. "Not with you beside me." She leaned into his shoulder, warm and real. "Then we'll face what comes." He reached for her hand, fingers interlocking. He didn't speak for a long time. "I never thought I'd be part of something steady," he said. "Never thought I'd have a home that wasn't just a roof." She kissed the side of his neck where the skin dipped beneath his collar. "You have one now, and you're not alone in it." The wind rustled the grass like a hand smoothing a blanket, and Zakarias watched the dark, calm and ready, a second room and a leather ring. By mid-April, the thaw had turned the ridge soft enough to work again. Zakarias rose with the sun shouldering pine beams one at a time. He hammered the second room into shape with the steady rhythm of someone laying roots. Inside, Theodora stacked herbs in glass jars along the new shelves. Her sleeves rolled her hair tied back. The children played near the creek boots, soaked laughter rising through the trees. Zakarias paused to watch them all from the threshold. Theodora joined him, her hand brushing his arm. "You ever think about what comes next?" "I do," he said. "Not the way I used to. I used to think it'd all be taken. Now I think about how to keep it strong." She stepped barefoot onto the porch. The breeze carried the scent of early lilacs. "There's a preacher coming through in May," she said. "He stops at the river settlement." Zakarias leaned on the post. "You thinking about going? I'm thinking about marrying you." He looked at her. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've never been more." He reached into his coat and pulled out a loop of leather, braided worn-shaped into a rose. "Started this the day you said you were staying for good. Didn't know what I'd say when the time came." She took it. "This is better than gold. Then wear it when we go." And she did. A wedding beneath the cottonwood. They were married beneath a wind-bent cottonwood that leaned east like it too had survived things. The tree stood just beyond the meadow, where the grass grew long and wild, brushing the knees of those who passed. It wasn't much of a crowd, just the preacher who arrived on a mule with a beard like knotted rope, and the children dressed in their best with faces solemn and scrubbed. Theodora wore a dress dyed with crushed walnut husks. The fabric faded but mended with care. On her head a crown of dried thistle and prairie sage woven by Elaine with tiny fingers and bright pride. EMTT carried the ring in a tin tobacco box, holding it in both hands like treasure. Zakarias stood still, arms by his sides, eyes locked on her like she was the sun rising over land he never believed he'd own. When the preacher spoke, it was few words and gravel-voiced, but true. No ribbons, no pomp, just two people standing where the wind could touch them, and the truth of their hearts didn't need dressing up. The ring wasn't gold. It was leather, braided and worn soft at the curve where his hands had shaped it across weeks of waiting. He slid it onto her finger like a promise long held. She whispered something, then something only he heard, and he nodded, not because he needed to answer, but because he already had. They rode back slow through the tall grass, hand in hand, the sun dipping behind them. And for once, Zakarias Steel didn't feel like a man arriving. He felt like a man who'd come home. A season of plenty. A life-taking route. The summer that followed their wedding was kind. The land gave freely beans climbing high squash, swelling heavy under leaf, and the herbs drying in bunches along the rafters. Theodora worked the earth with knowledge passed down her hands, knowing exactly when to water, when to wait. She showed Elaine how to cut stems without bruising the roots, and Zakarias watched them, arms crossed, heart fuller than he let on. He built a fence around the garden to keep deer out tall enough that even the boldest wouldn't try. He reinforced the chicken coop, added a screen to the door to keep flies out and laughter in. EMTT helped where he could, dragging water. Collecting eggs, hauling sticks, he declared essential. He also carved a new cradle, this one, smaller, smoother. He didn't say anything about it, just placed it beside their bed one morning like it had always belonged there. Theodora said nothing either, but her hand lingered on the edge when she passed it. She moved slower now, not tired exactly, but aware. Zakarias noticed how she pressed a hand to her belly when no one watched. He didn't ask, just kept watch. Waited. He was good at waiting, the quiet announcement. It was late evening when she told him. Rain ticked gently against the windows and the fire glowed low. Zakarias sat at the table carving a new handle for EMTT's sled. Theodora came to him slowly, her face soft, fingers fiddling with the edge of her shawl. She didn't sit right away, just stood, then reached for his hand and placed it against the curve of her stomach. He looked up. "Spring will bring more than green," she said quietly. He didn't say a word. He just rose, cradled her face in his hand, and kissed her, slow, long, certain. He held her close for a long while after forehead pressed to hers, one hand resting where new life had begun. Later, as she fell asleep against his chest, he lay awake staring into the rafters, counting the number of boards he'd need to reinforce the cradle, what wall to move if space was needed. He had never planned for a future before her. Now it was all he could think about. Celas is born. When the leaves turned gold and fire orange along the ridge, their son was born. In the second room Zakarias had built with his own hands. The labor was long, but steady. Theodora didn't cry out. She breathed through it, grit in her spine and gentleness in her gaze. Zakarias never left her side. He cooled her forehead with damp cloths, whispered her name, counted each breath like a vow. Elaine waited outside the door holding EMTT's hand so tightly his knuckles paled. The fire crackled and the wind stayed quiet as though the earth itself knew not to intrude. When the baby came, his cry was strong and quick, no hesitation. Theodora held him first, chest rising in relief and awe. She named him Galas after her grandfather, a quiet man who had taught her how to plant in straight rows and read the stars by feel. Zakarias took the boy in his arms, felt his heartbeat thrum against his palm like a drumbeat from God. He whispered a promise into his son's soft ear, words meant for no one else, not even Theodora. That night they all slept under the same roof, and not even the wind dared disturb them. The life they made, and the quiet that held. In the months that followed, the days blended not because they were dull, but because they were steady. Elaine practiced letters by the fire, her tongue poking out in concentration. EMTT tried to build another raft, though the first had sunk after 10 feet. He declared it a success anyway. Theodora taught Celas to smile with only her voice and the warmth of her hands. Zakarias no longer rose, wondering where he might go. His boots found familiar paths, now trails worn between fence-lined coop garden cabin. And each night when the fire burned low and the children's breaths deepened into sleep, he looked over at Theodora and saw something he'd never believed he'd find, a woman who'd chosen to stay. He never spoke much about the man he used to be. He didn't have to. She could see it in the way he watched over them, listened more than he spoke, and fixed what was broken before it was noticed. He had spent years surviving. Now he was learning how to live. A thief's shadow. A father's calm. Spring came soft and steady. The ground dried in patches and crocuses bloomed near the edge of the forest. But with thaw also came threat. Zakarias spotted it first, a set of boot prints near the edge of the ridge. Too small to be his, too fresh to be accidental. He followed them far enough to see where they paused, where someone had crouched behind a fir tree watching. Tracks circled back, careful and deliberate. Not the path of a hunter, not the meandering of a trapper. That evening he returned home with his rifle slung higher on his shoulder, jaw tight. "Someone's been near," he said as he dropped the firewood by the door. "Watching." Theodora's eyes narrowed, but her hands didn't shake as she stirred the stew. "You think they'll come back?" "I think they're deciding." She didn't ask him to stay inside more. She didn't ask if they were safe. She just trusted him and the land to know. "We'll keep the lamp burning," she said. He nodded once. "And I'll keep the rifle loaded." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Zakarias sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees. The stars were sharp, the moon thin. His hand stayed still, his breath calm. Theodora stood in the doorway. "You expecting someone?" "No," he answered, voice steady. "But I've learned not to be surprised." She stepped outside and sat beside him. And there they waited quiet together, not afraid. Not just a roof, but a home. The wind stirred the grass like an invisible hand smoothing a child's hair. The dark pressed in, but not heavily. The night was clear. Zakarias leaned back slightly, one arm wrapped around Theodora's shoulder, the other still resting across the rifle. "I never thought I'd be part of something steady," he said, eyes on the horizon. "Never thought I'd have a home that wasn't just four walls and a roof." Theodora didn't speak right away. She leaned into his side, her cheek brushing the worn canvas of his coat. "You have one now," she said, "and you're not alone in it." He exhaled long and slow, the kind of breath a man only takes when the world around him finally softens. "You're not just safe here," she added. "You're loved." He turned his head toward her just slightly. "I spent so long preparing to leave, it's strange to know I've nowhere else to go." She reached up, brushing the edge of his scar with the back of her fingers. "That's because you're already where you belong." And in that moment, beneath the hush of stars and the sound of quiet things settling into earth, he finally believed her. Raising walls. Raising children. By mid-April, the ridge had dried enough for real work to begin again. Zakarias started rising before dawn, hammer in hand, boots thick with mud and the scent of thawing pine in the air. He was finishing the second room. Not out of necessity, but out of intent. Pine boards that had cured through winter now became walls. Frames a window facing east so the morning light would always reach where the cradle stood. Theodora filled glass jars with dried herbs, labeling each one in tidy script, lining them on new shelves Zakarias had carved himself. Inside the house, Elaine practiced her reading at the new table. EMTT scraped together bits of wire and bark and claimed he was building a trap for imaginary creatures. Celis cooed from his cradle, reaching towards sunlight without understanding its source. Every corner of the home hummed with quiet motion. With intention, Zakarias paused once standing in the doorway, hammer hanging from his fingers, and watched it all unfold. The woman he loved, the children he protected, the land that no longer felt like something to survive. It felt like theirs. Theodora's thought, what comes? As after Theodora came to stand beside him one morning, her apron dusted with flour, her braid tucked under a handkerchief. She looked out over the ridge, the sky awash of peach and blue. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. Zakarias didn't answer at first. He looked out at the trees at the creek just beyond where the children played. "I do," he said at last. "Not like I used to. I used to think about how fast it could all disappear. And now," he glanced at her, then back to the ridge. "Now I think about how to keep it strong." She nodded slowly. "There's a traveling preacher due through in May," she said. "Stops by the river settlement each spring." He turned fully to face her, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You thinking about going?" She didn't hesitate. "I'm thinking about marrying you." The wind picked up slightly, tugging at her braid. "I've never been more sure of anything." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thin strip of braided leather shaped into a rose. "I made this the day you said you were staying for good. Didn't know what I'd say when the time came." She took it, fingers trembling only slightly. "This is better than gold." "Then wear it when we go." A vow spoken true. The day of their wedding was simple. No guests but the children, no music but the breeze, no canopy but the wide Montana sky. They stood beneath the same cottonwood where they had once spoken of staying through winter. This time they vowed forever. The preacher's voice was low, gritty, and brief. "Marriage is work," he said. "Harder than land, but more worth keeping." Then he nodded, stepped back, and let silence settle between them like a sacred hush. Theodora wore her walnut-dyed dress, the one she had once mended by firelight. On her head a crown of thistle wild mint and dried white clover. Elaine clapped when she saw it. EMTT, carry the ring face, solemn eyes wide. Zakarias didn't smile, but his hands were steady as he slid the leather ring onto her finger. "You are my home," he said barely above a whisper. "You are my safe," she returned. And that was enough. They rode home slow, the sun dipping low, hand in hand, and the land welcomed them not as wanderers, but as something settled. Something sacred, something lasting. The garden fence and the waiting silence. The weeks that followed their wedding blurred into work, quiet, nourishing work. The sun grew higher, and Zakarias's hands stayed calloused from digging, hammering, sanding. He built a new fence around the garden, this one taller and stronger than the last, shaped from logs stripped and cured in the late snow melt. Inside, Theodora moved carefully. Her pace slowed, her breath shorter, her hand resting against her belly more often. She said nothing. He still didn't ask. Instead, he watched her. He watched the way she stood at the stove, humming low as she stirred broth. The way she guided Elaine's hand through stitching seams. The way her eyes closed just briefly when Celis laughed for the first time and clapped tiny palms together. He sanded the cradle again, not because it needed it, but because it calmed him. One evening she pressed his hand to her belly and said simply, "Spring will bring more than shoots." He nodded. No reply needed. He had known. He had waited. And in that waiting, something tender took root inside him that no storm could uproot. Nights of longing and knowing. The rain came back one evening, soft not angry, and the roof held firm. Zakarias sat by the fire, polishing the rifle out of habit more than need. Theodora folded linens at the table, her movements slow but sure. The children had already gone to sleep. Outside, the wind swept gently against the cabin walls. Inside, the silence was warm. I was afraid Theodora said suddenly, eyes on her hands. After Thomas died. Not just of loneliness, of wanting someone again. Zakarias didn't answer right away. He set the rifle down and stood, crossed to her. "I was afraid of being seen," he said, "like I wasn't worth anything more than what I'd survived." She looked up at him, and now I still feel it sometimes. But when I see you holding our son, when I see you teaching Elaine, when I hear EMTT call my name," he paused, swallowing, "I feel like I've been rebuilt." Theodora stood slowly, setting the linen aside. She pressed her palms to his chest. "You're not a man stitched together from what was left. You're a man worthy of everything new." He leaned forward, then slow, as if touching something sacred. They didn't go to bed that night to sleep. Spring's softest morning. The first morning, Theodora couldn't rise on her own. Zakarias noticed before she said a word. He had gotten up early as usual to tend to the traps and gather eggs. When he returned, he found her still lying in bed, her face pale but peaceful hand resting atop her belly. "I'm fine," she whispered. He didn't press. He simply brought her tea, placed a basin of warm water by the bed, and adjusted the quilt so it didn't press too hard against her growing middle. Elaine and EMTT tiptoed around the cabin, their voices hushed like chapel whispers. Even Silas, in his infant way, seemed to understand the stillness of the day. Zakarias spent the afternoon mending the porch rail, though his eyes kept drifting toward the cabin window. She called for him just before supper. He entered, hat in hand. "I was remembering," she said softly. "The day I met you, the wind, the rifle, the silence. I didn't know how much of my life would begin the moment I didn't pull that trigger." He stepped to the side of the bed, knelt. "I knew," he said. "The moment I saw you standing with those children eyes steady." Theodora reached out and took his hand. "Then stay. Just stay right here tonight." And he did. A house with enough rooms for joy. By mid-May, the second room was nearly finished. Zakarias had trimmed the window with fur, sanded the sill smooth enough for Silas to lean against when he learned to stand. Theodora had chosen a soft blue-gray paint for the walls, a color like the morning sky before the sun rose high. She wanted the room to feel like promise. The children helped too. Elaine laid out folded linens in a chest Zakarias had made when she was a baby. EMTT insisted on placing his favorite carved horse on the shelf beside the cradle. "We'll need a third room soon," Theodora said one morning, laughter behind her voice. Zakarias raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning something I should know about?" She smiled. "I'm saying, this house is becoming something alive. Not just boards and nails, but rooms that hold joy." He nodded, looking around. "I'll build as many as we need." She stepped closer, placed her hands gently on either side of his face. "Just don't build a wall between us." His reply came without hesitation. "Never." A new kind of strength. Theodora went into labor on a cloudless morning in June. The sun hung high over the trees, but the cabin was cool, shaded, hushed. Elaine took EMTT and Celis to the creek as planned. Zakarias stayed by Theodora's side with a basin of water, a folded cloth, and hands steadier than they'd ever been. She didn't cry out, only breathed long, focused, strong. Hours passed in rhythm contractions, rest contractions, breath. When the baby came, it was not with struggle, but with grace. A daughter. Quiet at first, then crying pink and powerful in Theodora's arms. Zakarias sat beside them, both his eyes brimming. "You did it," he said. Theodora leaned her head against his shoulder. "No, we did." He kissed her temple, then the baby's crown. The tiny girl reached up without knowing toward the heat of his breath. Outside, birds called across the trees. Inside, time stood still, held in the hush of new life. They named her Rowan, after the tree that survives both fire and frost, the garden fence and the waiting silence. The weeks that followed their wedding blurred into work, quiet, nourishing work. The sun grew higher, and Zakarias's hands stayed calloused from digging, hammering, sanding. He built a new fence around the garden, this one taller and stronger than the last, shaped from logs, stripped and cured in the late snow melt. Inside, Theodora moved carefully. Her pace slowed, her breath shorter, her hand resting against her belly more often. She said nothing. He still didn't ask. Instead, he watched her. He watched the way she stood at the stove, humming low as she stirred broth, the way she guided Elaine's hand through stitching seams, the way her eyes closed just briefly when Celis laughed for the first time and clapped tiny palms together. He sanded the cradle again, not because it needed it, but because it calmed him. One evening she pressed his hand to her belly and said simply, "Spring will bring more than shoots." He nodded. No reply needed. He had known. He had waited. And in that waiting, something tender took root inside him that no storm could uproot. Nights of longing and knowing. The rain came back one evening, soft, not angry, and the roof held firm. Zakarias sat by the fire, polishing the rifle out of habit more than need. Theodora folded linens at the table, her movements slow but sure. The children had already gone to sleep. Outside, the wind swept gently against the cabin walls. Inside, the silence was warm. "I was afraid," Theodora said suddenly, eyes on her hands. "After Thomas died, not just of loneliness, of wanting someone again." Zakarias didn't answer right away. He set the rifle down and stood, crossed to her. "I was afraid of being seen," he said, "like I wasn't worth anything more than what I'd survived." She looked up at him, and now I still feel it sometimes. But when I see you holding our son, when I see you teaching Elaine, when I hear EMTT call my name, he paused, swallowing. I feel like I've been rebuilt. Theodora stood slowly, setting the linen aside. She pressed her palms to his chest. "You're not a man stitched together from what was left. You're a man worthy of everything new." He leaned forward, then slow, as if touching something sacred. They didn't go to bed that night to sleep. Spring's softest morning. The first morning Theodora couldn't rise on her own, Zakarias noticed before she said a word. He had gotten up early as usual to tend to the traps and gather eggs. When he returned, he found her still lying in bed, her face pale but peaceful, hand resting atop her belly. "I'm fine," she whispered. He didn't press. He simply brought her tea, placed a basin of warm water by the bed, and adjusted the quilt so it didn't press too hard against her growing middle. Elaine and EMTT tiptoed around the cabin, their voices hushed like chapel whispers. Even Salas, in his infant way, seemed to understand the stillness of the day. Zakarias spent the afternoon mending the porch rail, though his eyes kept drifting toward the cabin window. She called for him just before supper. He entered, hat in hand. "I was remembering," she said softly, "the day I met you. The wind, the rifle, the silence. I didn't know how much of my life would begin the moment I didn't pull that trigger." He stepped to the side of the bed, knelt. "I knew," he said, "the moment I saw you standing with those children eyes steady." Theodora reached out and took his hand. "Then stay. Just stay right here tonight." And he did. A house with enough rooms for joy. By mid-May, the second room was nearly finished. Zakarias had trimmed the window with fur, sanded the sill smooth enough for Salas to lean against when he learned to stand. Theodora had chosen a soft blue-gray paint for the walls, a color like the morning sky before the sun rose high. She wanted the room to feel like promise. The children helped too. Elaine laid out folded linens in a chest Zakarias had made when she was a baby. EMTT insisted on placing his favorite carved horse on the shelf beside the cradle. "We'll need a third room soon," Theodora said one morning, laughter behind her voice. Zakarias raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning something I should know about?" She smiled. "I'm saying, this house is becoming something alive, not just boards and nails, but rooms that hold joy." He nodded, looking around. "I'll build as many as we need." She stepped closer, placed her hands gently on either side of his face. "Just don't build a wall between us." His reply came without hesitation. "Never." A new kind of strength. Theodora went into labor on a cloudless morning in June. The sun hung high over the trees, but the cabin was cool, shaded, hushed. Elaine took EMTT and Salas to the creek as planned. Zakarias stayed by Theodora's side with a basin of water, a folded cloth, and hands steadier than they'd ever been. She didn't cry out, only breathed long, focused strong. Hours passed in rhythm contractions, rest contractions, breath. When the baby came, it was not with struggle, but with grace. A daughter, quiet at first, then crying pink and powerful in Theodora's arms. Zakarias sat beside them, both his eyes brimming. "You did it," he said. Theodora leaned her head against his shoulder. "No, we did." He kissed her temple, then the baby's crown. The tiny girl reached up without knowing toward the heat of his breath. Outside, birds called across the trees. Inside, time stood still, held in the hush of new life. They named her Rowan, after the tree that survives both fire and frost. Rowan's first winter. Rowan's first winter came early and bit deep. Snow fell heavy by November, blanketing the roof and yard, burying the fence posts until only their tops showed like teeth through a shroud. But inside the cabin, the fire never dimmed. Zakarias had chopped more wood than usual that fall. His shoulders ached and his palms blistered beneath his gloves, but he never once let the pile run low. Theodora, though tired from nursing, and night cries, cooked warm stews and kept herbs steeping for tea. Elaine helped tend the baby, rocking her when her mother needed rest. EMTT fetched water-split kindling and took quiet pride when Zakarias nodded without words. They all had their part. Rowan bundled tight in quilts stitched by Theodora, and lined with old shirts of Zakarias's, slept soundly by the hearth. Her cheeks were always pink from warmth, her tiny fists curled against her chest, like the world outside had never touched her. One evening, as snow whispered against the windows, and Zakarias held Rowan in one arm while stoking the fire with the other, Theodora looked over at him, eyes shining. "You are born for this," she whispered. He looked down at the baby in his arms. "I think I was born waiting for her." And for the first time that winter, he smiled fully. Elaine's letters and EMTT's maps. Elaine had grown tall in the years since they'd first arrived. Her handwriting had straightened, her spelling sharpened, and her eyes now carried a clarity like her mother's, steady and watchful. She began writing letters again, even though she had no address to send them to. Letters to a cousin she barely remembered. Letters to the mother she feared losing during the last labor but never did. Sometimes she read them aloud by firelight. EMTT now, with legs long enough to chase rabbits but just as likely to trip over his own boots, had taken to drawing maps. Not real ones, exactly imaginings of their land as kingdoms, forests, as unknown territories, the creek as a serpent trail. He declared Zakarias the commander of the southern ridge, and Theodora the guardian of the garden gate. One evening, he unrolled a parchment made from stitched-together flour sacks and pointed to a spot marked with an X. "What's that?" Zakarias asked. "The place where we first found Mama," EMTT said. "The beginning of the kingdom." Zakarias said nothing, but later that night he slipped the map into the chest with the birth records and Theodora's braid ribbon. Some things deserved keeping. Theodora, and the light in the garden. By spring, Rowan was toddling in uneven steps across the dirt path between the cabin and the garden. Theodora walked beside her hand, hovering near but never holding, letting the child find her own feet. The sun warmed their backs and bees buzzed between the squash blossoms. Elaine helped plant corn, measuring the distance between holes with a length of twine. EMTT chased birds from the rows, yelling with more glee than menace. Zakarias stood near the fence with one hand resting on the gate post, watching the scene unfold like a vision. Not dramatic, not grand, just right. Theodora turned to him, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Do you remember when I couldn't take 2 steps without bracing myself?" He nodded. "And now look." She gestured to Rowan, who had stumbled to her knees but pushed herself back up with a determined grunt. "I do more than remember," Zakarias said. "I carry it." And he did. Every season, every cry, every joy. He carried them all. Zakarias's dream of the orchard. That year, for the first time, Zakarias dreamed forward instead of backward. It came one night after a long day of planting. He lay with Theodora's head on his chest, her breathing slow and even, and his mind wandered. He saw an orchard, apple trees lined in perfect rows, children running between them, Rowan's hair flying EMTT whittling branches, Elaine sketching leaves into her journal. He saw himself beneath one of the trees, older, slower but content. Theodora sat on a bench beside him, her hand in his, their knees touching. A grandchild tugged his sleeve and asked for a story. He hadn't thought of old age much before. It had always seemed like a gift reserved for other men. But now it felt possible. Not guaranteed but earned. In the morning he mentioned it over coffee. An orchard. Theodora smiled. "You dreaming of planting trees we won't see bear fruit? I think I am." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "Then let's do it anyway. Seeds for years. They'll never see that spring. They planted 2 apple saplings by the eastern fence." Theodora held Rowan on her hip while EMTT and Zakarias dug the holes. Elaine watered the roots carefully, reading the instructions aloud from a borrowed pamphlet as though reciting scripture. "These won't give fruit for years," Zakarias said, tamping the earth down gently. "I know," Theodora said, "but someone will eat from them." They stood in a loose circle around the trees. The wind blew soft, rustling new leaves, lifting Theodora's braid like a banner. Rowan laughed and clapped, and EMTT called it a blessing. Zakarias looked down at the dirt caked into his palms, the sweat on his collar, the ache in his spine, and he had never felt more rich.